on ABC.
By the turn of the 20th century, it was a far different America than the one envisioned by the men who'd written the Constitution slightly more than 100 years before. Instead of being a newly separated segment of an empire, America was one. The defeat of Spain gave the U.S. colonies of its own: Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. The constitutional uneasiness Thomas Jefferson had felt about acquiring new territory next door was replaced by a national readiness to assert American influence in the international arena.
The oceans ceased to be barriers separating us from the rest of the world. Like it or not, we were involved in the business of other countries. And in 1917, we joined Britain and France in a war against Germany and her allies. World War I, the Great War. 21 million dead. Survivors came home to a new world. The Wall Street, down which returning veterans marched, was on the edge of a boom. Industrial production doubled during the 20s, the dollar decade, people called it. The 20s were bountiful years for millions of Americans. The automobile created a revolution. The car was the country's most desired commodity and its biggest industry. The business of America is business, said President Coolidge, and for expanding numbers of Americans, it was paying off. In the 1922 novel Babbitt, Sinclair Lewis made fun of the prosperous, middle-aged, middle-class businessman. A men's club hears a speech from real estate operator George Babbitt.
Our ideal citizen goes happily to bed. Conscience clear, having contributed his mite to the prosperity of the city and to his own bank account. The idea of American manhood and culture isn't a lot of cranks sitting around chewing the rag about their rights and their wrongs, but a God-fearing, hustling, successful, two-fisted regular guy.
While some prospered, other regular guys barely made a living. Labor trouble reflected the underside of the decade's economics. Radicals in the labor movement seemed to be connected with the communist world revolution. The Justice Department ordered raids and roundups of suspected communists. Homes were invaded. Thousands were held without trial. Constitutional rights took a back seat to the red scale. In 1923, novelist Upton Sinclair addressed a crowd of striking dock workers in California. He was arrested and charged with orating certain thoughts and theories which were detrimental to the orderly conduct of the affairs of business. What Sinclair had been reading to the crowd was the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. In 1919, the 18th Amendment brought prohibition. It was now illegal and indeed unconstitutional to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages. It made common men criminal and criminals common, ushering in a world of speakeasies, bathtub gin, and gang warfare over illegal territory. A year after Prohibition, another constitutional change altered America's social fabric. After decades of struggle, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, 133 years after the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution. Women went through other changes too: smoking in public, wearing cosmetics, abandoning corsets. One of the changes that made the 20s roar was a social atmosphere charged with intimations of sex. Wherever society was heading, it was going there on a stream of jazz. Its musical abandon captured the time. Barriers were falling everywhere. For those who could tap into the decade's possibilities, speed, and the beat raced on. But the decade ended with a bang. In 1929, as the gap between rich and poor widened, the stock market crashed. The boom went bust. It was the beginning of the Great Depression. Bank closings, layoffs, 9 million savings accounts wiped out.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done, brother, heaven's paradise.
Republican President Herbert Hoover was suggesting that, left alone, business was recovering. It wasn't. Hoover lost to an opponent promising radical change, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Start campaign slogan, Sissy. Good, that's right.
Despite that nice little charade with his granddaughter, happy days were not here again and were not even in sight. By the time of his inauguration in March of 1933, the country was virtually paralyzed.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
He called his program the New Deal, a term from the poker table, of course, meaning everybody gets a new hand, a new set of cards, another chance. Roosevelt's National Recovery Act asked business to raise wages and shorten hours to help get people back to work. The Agricultural Adjustment Act tried to raise farm prices. The constitutional question was, could government solve economic and social crises by forced controls on business? Much of business hated the controls, of course, and it found sympathy in the Supreme Court. The court struck down 8 of 10 New Deal recovery measures.
And I defy anyone to read the opinions concerning the AAA, the National Recovery Act, and tell us exactly what is anything we can do for the industrial worker in this session of the Congress with any reasonable certainty that what we do will not be nullified as unconstitutional.
Earlier in 1933, in the middle of this constitutional battle, 2 amendments were ratified. The 20th started the term of the president in meetings of Congress in January instead of March. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. Brewers, distributors, bartenders could go back to making an honest living. But for a third of American workers, there still were no jobs. Roosevelt put millions on the federal payroll. He attacked his opponents in the judiciary, and he sent Congress a bill that would allow him to appoint more justices to the Supreme Court.
We have reached the point as a nation where we must take action to save the Constitution from the court and the court from itself.
Court packing, the critics called it. It was seen as an assault on the constitutional separation of powers.
It has been said the Supreme Court follows the election returns, and that's what was about to happen to Roosevelt's economic and social reform. The court was about to make a seismic shift in its view of all that New Deal legislation.
And it all started with another one of those little cases with big principles involving another ordinary person. Her name was Elsie Parrish.
At the apple capital of the world, the Festival of Apple Blossoms.
The story begins in the spring of 1935 in Wenatchee, Washington, the center of America's largest apple market.
It's a lively occasion at Wenatchee, Washington, as the floats roll by.
In the 1930s, tourists drawn to the festival often stayed at the Cascadian Hotel. The Cascadian was owned by the West Coast Hotel Company. 37-year-old Elsie Parrish, mother of 6, already a grandmother, worked as a chambermaid. She earned 25 cents an hour. In May of 1935, when times were tough for employees and employers alike, the Cascadian Hotel dismissed Elsie Parrish. They offered a financial settlement well below what she was due under Washington's ill-enforced minimum wage law for women and minors. She said no and took them to court. And so, one of the largest hotel chains in America was bound to do legal battle with a straightforward chambermaid named Elsie Parrish.
I reside in Wenatchee, Washington. I've been employed by the West Coast Hotel Company doing general maid service, such as making beds, cleaning, dusting, etc., which is generally known as chambermaid work. All of the work was done at the Cascadian Hotel, Wenatchee, Chelan County, Washington. There was nothing said about wages when I was hired. I took what they gave me because I needed the work so badly. And I figured the defendant would pay what was right, the state wage. When I was discharged, I was offered $17 in full by Mr. Abel, manager of the hotel, and I did not accept it. I then told him that I was entitled to $216.19, which I demanded.
Elsie Parrish lost the first round. The Superior Court of Chelan County found that the state minimum wage law was unconstitutional. The county court cited Supreme Court rulings which had 5 times before struck down minimum wage laws. Elsie and her lawyer, C.B. Connor, would not quit. And in April of 1936, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled in Elsie's favor. West Coast Hotel carried the battle on to the United States Supreme Court, where, if Elsie Parrish were to win, the court would have to reverse itself. The Monday after Easter, March 29, 1937, the Supreme Court decided the case. Thousands of tourists and children with their Easter baskets jammed the steps of the recently opened Supreme Court building. What they heard was a historic reversal, as the decision in favor of Elsie Parrish and the concept of minimum wages for women was read by Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes.
The legislature was entitled to adopt measures to reduce the evils of the sweating system, the exploiting of workers at wages so low as to be insufficient to meet the bare cost of living.
The Elsie Parrish case shows how quickly the Constitution can change. On Easter Sunday, 1937, minimum wage laws were unconstitutional. The next day, Elsie Parrish could, under the Constitution, claim her $216.19, and 6 million other working women could make similar claims. 2 weeks after the Parrish decision, the Supreme Court upheld the National Labor Relations Act, and within a year had declared constitutional a law setting minimum wages and maximum hours for both men and women.
Our first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, said at the beginning that this nation would have to develop a capacity to provide for future contingencies as they happen. Today is one of those contingencies. More than 70% of the workforce is no longer in manufacturing or agriculture. Many of our traditional industries are closing down, and their employees are out of work with no training to get other jobs. As during the Great Depression, people are looking to the government to protect their economic blessings of liberty.
Country 98 FM, KGAM, Ogden, Provo, Salt Lake City.
Utah. Over 100 years ago, railroads from the east and west merged in this wilderness. A triumph of America's unmatched industrial might. Now, the country's heavy industries are in their twilight years. The end of an era. For millions of workers, the end of a dream.
I feel like we was let down, betrayed. We were given anything we had during the time we worked for them. I thought it was just pure lifestyle, but how quickly things can change.
When U.S. Steel closed its plant in Orem, Utah last year, 1,900 workers lost their jobs. They joined 11 million other Americans who've been thrown out of work by plant closings since 1979.
It's really sad because you can see the curtain is sitting around and it's just like walking into a ghost town. It's just dead. I haven't had any work at all for 11 months now. I might lose my house. My kids are so young that it's hard to explain to them that Daddy doesn't have the money that he used to have.
While federal attempts to help victims of plant closings are locked in congressional debate, some states are taking action on their own.
60 degrees and cloudy in Greater Augusta, and on your radio, it's Cruising 1280.
The constitutionality of one state's attempt to aid displaced workers was recently tested by a case that pitted big business against Maine. Between 1971 and 81, over 100 plants in Maine closed down. More than 20,000 workers were left without jobs.
We're dealing with human beings, people who built their lives in the community, so the people who paid their taxes for years. And when a company pulls up and leaves, here in Maine, we think they're owed more than a handshake. For that reason, we passed a law, simple law, which says if you lose your job and the company's not bankrupt, you ought to get a week's pay for every year you work.
The state severance pay law was challenged by the Port Halifax Packing Company, which closed its poultry processing plant in 1981. In a case which reached the Supreme Court this year, the company was supported by the Reagan administration and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
I think it is an intrusion into their constitutional rights, their freedom of contract, the impairment of contract, the notion that they should be allowed to operate their businesses without a lot of various restrictions on what they can and can't do in terms of economic decisions.
As plants continue to close around the country, the Chamber fears a patchwork of state laws which will impede business, hurting employers and workers alike. They also argue that legislation forged during the Depression put protection of workers in federal hands.
And that was really the constitutional battle. And would the federal government be the only place that could protect the rights of working people? Or could states have some rights as well?
On June 1st, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, upheld Maine severance law. Workers like Norris Willett will get their extra payment. Laid off by the Port Halifax plant 6 years ago, he's been cutting and selling wood to make a living. The severance money will help.
Even though it's coming real late, it'll still be up. You know, you lose your job and it makes it hard.
When we're talking about economic justice and the degree to which government could interfere with the free flow of capital, those are economic decisions and they're also moral decisions. And our Constitution must allow that opportunity to move. And when you do that, the Constitution comes alive.
18 other states are considering bills to help workers affected by plant closing. Those states may take some encouragement from the fact that the experiment in Maine is now constitutional.
When we come back, a remarkable justice and a little girl reinterpret the Constitution.